Thank you for joining me to talk about economic reform in China. So, I think that for most of us, when we think about economic reform in China, we really think about the last 3 decades of incredibly rapid growth, the Chinese economic miracle, basically. And so, basically, from the mid 80s, but definitely by the 90s. So the 90s and the 2000s, we see really fast economic growth in China, growth rates averaging about 10% a year. To compare that to a mature economy like the United States, if we're growing over 3% a year, we would consider that to be really fast growth. So for a big country like China, growing at 10% each year or more is really good. What we see though now is that time period, those last 3 decades of rapid growth, that time period seems to be over. So, what I'd like to talk about then in this brief lecture is I'd like to talk about why that's changing and how China needs to reform its economy. So, the past growth model, the growth model that resulted in that really rapid growth, was mostly driven by government investment and by exports. So, the export part of the picture, I think, is something that we're all really familiar with. This was where factories in China would use low skill manufacturing, they would create products, they would ship it to the United States and sell them for really low price points, right? So, that sort of export led manufacturing that was really successful in China for a time period, as well as a lot of government investment, mostly in transportation and infrastructure all around China. So this growth model was really successful. So it generated really rapid growth. It delivered millions of people out of poverty, and it also created infrastructure for a modern economy that China didn't have. But a lot of economists would talk about this as sort of low-hanging fruit, or sometimes they talk about the advantages of backwardness, that basically that type of economic growth is fairly easy to do. The problem with this model is that even though it delivered all of these good things, it also created a lot of local debt. So most of the provinces hold a lot of debt. It also created asset bubbles, so especially with the housing market, and it also led to a lot of corruption. So in addition to these problems, we're in a new time period, which in China they're calling the new normal. And it's basically a transition point where, despite the advantages and disadvantages of this former China model of economic growth, it's just no longer working. So, what we tend to see is lower growth rates. So, China has been averaging more like 6% of growth, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower, rather than the 10% that we've become accustomed to. And so we see that the economy is really unbalanced. So there's a lot of investment in heavy industry, there's a lot of investment in manufacturing. But as an economy becomes more mature, we would expect to see manufacturing decline and services increase. Just like what we see in the US today. Most new jobs are created in the service sector, not the manufacturing sector. And that's true for all of the large developed economies. So China right now is in this transition point. And the reason that we see that China is at this transition point is basically that has been a lot of demographic change as well as a lot of development in China. And so now that we're in this period, the so-called new normal, where we see lower growth rates, we can see that China needs to restructure its economy. The question is, what direction should it go, and how can they actually create this restructuring? So very quickly, when we think about what the new economy is going to look like, we know that it can't look like the old economy. And this is because of the changing demographics in China. So because China had the one-child policy until very recently, now we have a two-child policy, plus the reduction in fertility that happens in most major cities as there are more jobs created. People tend to wait longer to get married, they tend to have fewer children. So we see both trends happening in China at the same time, and the net result is that the fertility rate in China is very low. And so we actually see that not enough people are being born to replace people who are dying. So the replacement rate is very low. So if you look at China here in this chart, it's shown in the blue, and you can see that the fertility rate declined very quickly, but then has continued to decline. So even once China moved to a two-child policy, we see that most families are choosing to only have one child, simply because both parents are working and they're very busy, and so instead they're just having smaller and smaller families. So what this means then, if in an economic sense, is that we have a declining labor force. So the number of people who are in a working age population is declining, while the number of people who are retiring is increasing. And so this is oftentimes called the dependency ratio. So how many working age people do you have to support each person who retires? And if you look at this chart that I'm sharing with you, comparing China and Japan, because Japan is the highest dependency ratio in the world, if you look at China, which is represented in the blue, you can see that its dependency ratio is still less than that of Japan, but that it's increasing and it's following a similar trajectory. The concern is that even though China it has a slightly lower dependency ratio, it's still a really large dependency ratio, meaning that you have a very small working age population supporting a much, much larger retired population. Now, the problem with this is that this is happening in China when people in China are much poorer than they were in Japan at a similar point. So in Japan, you had this high dependency ratio, but you also had fairly wealthy families that were able to pay for social services for the people who were retiring. In China, you see that the country as a whole is much poorer. There aren't as many resources to support this retiring population, and you have this shrinking labor force. So what this has led to in one way is a positive outcome, and this is rising wages. So as the working age population shrinks and as there are more skills developed in China, so more and more of this smaller population then go on to college and gain more skills, you see that wages are increasing in China. This is a comparative chart showing where China is in the rest of Asia, but what you can see is that the idea of having low wage manufacturing in China is just no longer a reality. That for most companies, when they're thinking about where to site their factories for low wage assembly, China wouldn't be your choice. You would look instead more towards Bangladesh or Vietnam, which are receiving much more of this type of manufacturing. So what this means for China is that they're facing a smaller working age population. They're also facing a population that has higher skill level, but also demanding higher wages. So that leads us to what we frequently call the middle income trap. And this is basically where you see that as a country develops and becomes a middle income country, its economy also needs to transition away from that low skill, low wage manufacturing assembly towards higher value economic activity. So usually this is where countries start creating manufacturing products that are more value added, like computers or cars, or where they start to create more of a service sector. So this is the way then that countries typically grow out of the middle income trap. And so for China, the choice that they're facing with economic reform right now is what path to take. So they could follow the example of the other Asian countries that grew out of the middle income trap, like South Korea or Taiwan, which is where you go from manufacturing things made out of plastic to manufacturing things that have much more technology, much more skill involved, like semiconductors, computers, automobiles, consumer electronics. So this is one thing that we would expect that China would want to invest in. Also, though, this requires investing in labor productivity and a more skilled workforce. So just like the case of Germany, I think Germany is a great model to think of here, is that you can have a country that still does a lot of manufacturing, but this manufacturing is more value added. So you need more engineers and less assembly workers. You could also imagine that another way to grow out of this trap is simply to find new markets. However, what you tend to see is that China already sells its products to most countries around the world. So its ability to find new markets and continue to make the same products, that's probably, in the long run at least, not a very good plan. You also could see China, though, move in a different direction, and this would be more of what the US looks like. So the US economy is heavily based on a consumer market economy. So a lot of services, people mostly work in services. There's not a lot of manufacturing. And so you could also imagine that China could invest in becoming more of a consumer market economy. So these are some potential paths that China could take. It could either try to look more like Germany and continue to invest in manufacturing, but more value added manufacturing, or it could start to look more like the United States and try to create more of a consumer market economy. So these are some potential ways out of this middle income trap. But what we should expect in China is that the growth rates in China will continue to decline until it's able to climb out of this trap. So we should expect a number of years of economic reform where the growth rates in China are lower. If China is able, though, to move on one of these paths, either the Germany manufacturing path or the consumer market economy US path, what you would expect is that household income rates continue to climb, which then will create a whole new round of economic growth for China. So this economic growth will be different from the past model, which was really based on manufacturing, exports, and government investment. This will be much more based on consumer spending and household incomes increasing, but will likely be more sustainable. So what we would need to see, the types of reforms that we would then need to see, we know what some of these reforms are, but they're definitely not easy. And so we would need to see that China try to create reforms that would promote domestic consumption. So basically to create consumers. So some of these things that would be needed would basically be to encourage Chinese citizens as they earn more disposable income, rather than saving that income, which is what they do right now, instead to spend that disposable income. So in China, they have some of the highest saving rates in the world. And so what you would need to happen is that you would basically need people to decide that they were going to save less and spend more. And so this would be what would kickstart this consumer market economy. The problem is that the reason that people are saving so much is that China doesn't really have a very developed set of social safety nets. And so most families feel that they have to save in order to make sure that they're covered in case of some sort of health problem, or if somebody were to lose their job, children's education, or for a lot of families, the fact that since there isn't a really developed social security or pension system, when you retire, you need to have saved enough to support yourself in your old age. And so this is something then that China's going to need to invest in if they want people to stop saving that money and instead to start spending it. So they would need to create social safety nets like unemployment insurance. They would need to make sure that people could afford the cost of education for their children. They would need to make sure that people had a pension system and health insurance or some sort of health care. So this would be the social safety net that China would need to build in order to persuade families not to keep saving, but instead to start spending. Now, the problem with this is that China has a really large population, and as we talked about before, it has a large elderly population that is also poor. So when you think about creating a pension system or a social security system that can take care of such a large elderly population that's also a poor population, that's a really difficult problem, right? So in most economies around the world, the United States, Germany, France, governments are talking about how the social safety nets will basically bankrupt the government. So as you have a large baby boom population reach the age of retirement, these systems become really, really expensive. So in the case of China, which has a really large population, would it be able to afford some sort of comprehensive social security system? And so that's an open question of what could they afford? What would this look like? But if they can create this type of system, they would then be able to persuade families to start spending their disposable income rather than saving it. So the path forward is fairly clear, but the way to get there is going to be really difficult and is going to take some time. So what we see that the government has put forward as its reform package is sometimes called the 60-point decision. Don't worry, I won't go over all 60 points. Basically, I've summarized these into a few of the major packages. But basically, what is being suggested for economic reform in the future in China is basically first that there will be financial liberalization. And this is basically trying to create a more competitive private business sector, so less focus or reliance on state-owned enterprises that the government creates, and more the creation of small businesses, private firms. And so the government is trying to encourage the banks to lend to individual entrepreneurs who want to start their own companies. Also, you see that the government is trying to invest in creating more taxes for local governments so that they can avoid asset bubbles like what we see in housing. And again, we see this focus on the repair of the social safety net. This is really, really important, but as we talked about, really difficult. We also see that the government is focusing on trying to create a new system of property rights that would allow for people in rural areas to lease their land. This would allow for the creation of agribusiness. So instead of these really, really small plots that we see, the average plot in China is about 1/4 of an acre. And so rather than all of these small individual plots that farmers would lease their land to a large company that would create large farms and have agribusiness. So you would see the same amount of food output, but you would see that it would be that it would be a large agribusiness company. It would be much more efficient. So that's another focus. And then the last main focus for economic reform is that increasingly economic change would not be the province of the government, but it would rather be the province of the market, and so that there would be greater reliance on market forces. And so some of the large reforms that are slated to occur would be that there could be private investment in state-owned enterprises, which would slowly over time privatize these state-owned enterprises. Also, there's the creation of the anti-monopoly regulations, which would increase the ability of these new private firms that the government hopes will be created to compete against these really large state-owned enterprises. So state-owned enterprises will no longer be able to have a monopoly. So what you can see from this reform package is that the government seems to be focusing on both the Germany model and the US model. So they're really trying to create property rights and a social safety net so that people will stop saving and start investing and consuming, but also that they're trying to reform the economy to create more private firms that will invest in higher value-added manufacturing. So they recognize that this can't just be driven by state-owned enterprises, but that there need to be more private firms. So if you want an innovation economy or a high technology economy, that you might need more participation from private firms. So this is the direction of reform in China. And again, although the direction is fairly clear, it remains an open question as to whether China can reform its way out of the middle income trap. We call it a trap because a lot of countries don't ever actually grow out of it. So as we saw in Japan, we saw economic stagnation as they confronted these same demographic challenges that China is facing. So what we would want to see in the next decade is China's progress towards creating this higher value added, more innovative, more high tech economy, as well as creating a social safety net that would encourage people to spend rather than save. So when we think then about the future of reform in China, we could see that if these reforms go forward as planned, that China might potentially become more of a capitalist market economy, right, with more private firms and less state-owned enterprises. Or you could also see that the party creates even stronger state-owned enterprises and makes sure that state-owned enterprises have a really dominant position in the economy, which is what they've been doing for the last decade. So it's unclear whether creating more private firms and allowing for more market forces is just another part of the party's plan, or if this is actually more of a capitalist reform. But we see this focus, as you can see in this banner, this picture that I took from Beijing, that they're really focusing on this idea of innovation and trying to reform the economy. And so what we'll need to see then in the next decade is, does China start to look more like Germany and become a large value-added manufacturing power, or does it start to look more like the US and really invest in trying to create a strong consumer market economy, one with strong safety nets? So this is what we'll have to see for the next decade, whether China can successfully grow out of the middle income trap.